The call came at 6:12 a.m., just as the sun slipped through the curtains of her quiet Cancun suite. No urgency in the tone, just a sterile corporate voice delivering a decision already made somewhere far above her. Your role has been terminated. No explanation, no hesitation. 15 years of institutional memory reduced to a calendar invite and a 2-minute call. She didn't argue, didn't even ask why. Instead, she placed the phone face down, took a slow sip of coffee, and watched the ocean as if nothing had shifted. Because something had, and she knew it before they did. Systems don't forget. Dependencies don't disappear. And silence in a company like that? It never means stability. Back in the glass towers, dashboards were already flickering. Numbers didn't scream, but they leaned. Slightly at first, then harder. Access points began to stall. Workflows slowed. A report no one expected started forming in the background. 7 minutes later, it landed on the CFO's desk. And that was the moment the room stopped breathing. By 8:03 a.m., the office looked exactly the same. Glass walls, soft reflections, the low hum of machines pretending everything was under control. Assistants walked faster than usual, but not fast enough to admit something was wrong. Screens glowed with dashboards that still held their shape, barely. Numbers hadn't collapsed, not yet. But they had started to drift, like a compass nudged off true north. No one said her name. That was intentional. At 8:07, the first anomaly appeared. A routine logistics sync, normally invisible, lagged by 42 seconds. Not critical, not alarming, but unusual. The system flagged it in pale yellow, the kind that gets ignored in meetings. Still, one analyst paused longer than he should have. He couldn't explain why. Because he didn't know what he was looking at. She had built that layer 12 years ago, back when the company still thought in spreadsheets and optimism. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't visible. But it connected everything: vendor timing, internal routing, compliance triggers, quiet architecture, the kind you only notice when it stops breathing. At 8:12, a second delay. Different region, same pattern. The dashboards adjusted, slightly. A manager refreshed his screen twice, then minimized it. No need to escalate something so small. Not in front of the VP, who had just made a statement about modernizing talent and removing legacy dependencies. The room nodded. It always nodded. But the system didn't. At 8:19, 3 processes stalled in parallel. Now it was no longer random. Somewhere deep in the reporting engine, a cascade began. Not loud, not dramatic, just precise. Like a sequence that had always existed, waiting for one missing variable. Her variable. No alarms triggered yet. That would have required thresholds. And thresholds assumed failure looked obvious. This didn't. At 8:26, an internal routing table failed to reconcile. A minor discrepancy, 0.7%. Invisible in isolation. But the kind that multiplies quietly. The kind that touches contracts, timelines, penalties. The kind that accountants notice before engineers do. One of the senior analysts leaned back in his chair. "Why is this off?" he muttered. No one answered, because no one had the full map. She did. Or had. At 8:31, a regional system defaulted to fallback logic. An old protocol, rarely used, almost forgotten. It worked, technically, but slower, less efficient, slightly more expensive. The kind of inefficiency that doesn't break a company, but accumulates. A notification was sent, not urgent, just informational. It reached 3 inboxes. One of them belonged to the CFO's office, unread, for now. At 8:37, the first real signal appeared. A contract processing queue stalled completely. Not failed. Not crashed. Paused. As if waiting. An operations lead stood up, walked across the room, and said quietly, "We might have a dependency issue." The VP didn't look up. "We removed a dependency," he replied. "That was the point." Silence followed. Not agreement. Not disagreement. Just silence. Because somewhere between the lines, a different question was forming. What exactly had they removed? At 8:42, the system answered. A background process, one that almost no one remembered approving, generated a preliminary impact estimate. It pulled from historical flows, contractual penalties, delayed shipments, cascading inefficiencies. The number appeared slowly, as if the system itself hesitated. $90 million. No alert sound, no flashing red, just a figure, cold, precise, unemotional. The analyst who saw it first didn't speak immediately. He checked the inputs, refreshed the model, ran it again. Same result. His throat tightened, because numbers like that don't come from noise. They come from structure. At 8:45, he forwarded the report. Subject line: Preliminary impact, needs review. It landed in the CFO's queue. Still unread. Across the ocean, she stepped onto the balcony. The air was warm, steady, predictable, unlike systems built by committees and forgotten by those who approved them. She closed her eyes for a moment, not in regret, but in recognition. They had finally reached the part no one plans for, the part where absence becomes visible. And somewhere, deep inside the company she had just left, something else was about to surface. Something no dashboard had ever shown. Something no one had thought to ask about. Yet. At 8:52 a.m., the first person said it out loud. Pull the dependency map. It sounded reasonable, procedural, safe. But the room shifted anyway. Because everyone knew the map wasn't complete. It never had been. Screens filled with layers, systems, regions, vendors, routing logic, clean lines, structured flows. A diagram that looked convincing enough to calm a boardroom. But beneath it, something was missing. Not data, not access, context. At 8:55, they zoomed deeper. Clusters separated, functions expanded. Hidden nodes appeared. Legacy flags, undocumented overrides, exception handlers that had survived 3 restructurings and 2 leadership changes. The kind of code no one deletes because no one fully understands it. Who owns this module? Someone asked. No answer. Because ownership had been informal, transferred through conversations, not documentation. Decisions made in hallways, not tickets. Knowledge that didn't live in systems, but in one person's head. At 9:01, a junior engineer tried to trace a routing discrepancy. He followed the logic chain step by step. Input, validation, transformation, dispatch. Everything aligned until it didn't. One condition, small, almost invisible, redirected the entire flow through a path that wasn't in the official map. He frowned. Why would it do that? No one replied. Because the question assumed intent, and intent requires memory. At 9:04, the contract queue stalled again. Longer this time. Not a glitch, a pattern. A compliance officer leaned forward, scanning the delayed items. Deadlines were approaching. Penalty clauses weren't theoretical anymore. They were ticking. Each minute wasn't just time. It was exposure. At 9:07, the CFO opened the report. No reaction at first. He read it once. Then again. Then a third time, slower. Not looking for mistakes, but for confirmation. Because numbers at that scale don't ask for attention. They demand it. $90 million. Projected. Not realized? Yet. He stood up. Get me real-time inputs, he said quietly. No urgency in his voice. That was the signal. Urgency would have meant uncertainty. This was different. At 9:10, finance began recalculating. Not just losses, timing, cash flow distortions, contractual cascades, the ripple effect of delays across regions that didn't even know they were connected. A single inefficiency multiplied across layers that had always relied on silent coordination. Coordination that no longer existed. At 9:14, operations escalated. Now it had a label: systemic degradation. Still not a failure, still not critical, but trending. And trends in systems like this don't reverse on their own. At 9:18, someone finally said her name. Quietly, almost reluctantly. The room didn't react, but the silence changed, because saying her name turned abstraction into reality. It connected the anomalies, the delays, the unexplained logic, into a single, uncomfortable hypothesis. This wasn't random. This was structural. At 9:21, they searched for documentation, shared drives, archived folders, old project spaces. Fragments appeared: presentations, notes, half-finished diagrams. Enough to suggest complexity, not enough to reconstruct it, because what mattered most had never been written down. It had been understood. At 9:25, the VP finally looked at the screen. He didn't ask a question. He stared at the routing map, at the branching logic that no longer aligned with expectations, at the places where decisions had clearly been made, but not recorded, at the invisible architecture that had supported everything he now called legacy. He exhaled. "Can we bypass it?" he asked. A pause. Technically, yes. Strategically, uncertain. Because bypassing something you don't fully understand doesn't remove risk. It relocates it. At 9:29, engineering attempted a patch. Temporary, controlled, minimal impact. The system accepted it for 47 seconds, then rejected it. Not with an error. With silence. Processes didn't crash. They didn't alert. They simply stopped responding, as if the system itself was waiting for a condition that no longer existed. At 9:33, the CFO returned to his desk. He didn't sit immediately. Instead, he looked at the report again, then at the live data stream now aligning with it, point by point. Projection was becoming reality. Not all at once, but steadily, predictably, which made it worse. Because unpredictable failures can be dismissed. Predictable ones cannot. At 9:36, he spoke. "Who can stabilize this?" No one answered. Not because they didn't want to, because they didn't know how. And for the first time that morning, the company faced something it had spent years optimizing away. A single point of knowledge. Not a system, not a process, a person. At 9:40, the room fell completely silent. Not the passive silence of meetings. A different kind. The kind that forms when every available option has been evaluated, and none of them resolve the problem. The kind that forces a decision. Somewhere far from the glass walls and muted screens, the ocean moved in slow, indifferent rhythms. She checked her phone once. No messages. Not yet. But she didn't need one. Because systems always follow the same rule. They resist. Then they reveal. And right now, they were about to do both. If you've ever seen a system hold together on invisible knowledge, you already know what happens next. Because this isn't just about one decision. It's about the moment when a company realizes too late that efficiency erased the only thing that made it work. And what comes after that? That's where it gets uncomfortable. So before we go further, tell me this. Would you have walked away like she did? Or stayed and watched the system break from the inside? Subscribe if you want the full breakdown, because the next chapter is where the real leverage appears. And trust me, they're about to make a call they can't take back. At 9:47 a.m., the first call was made. Not to her. To legal. It was instinctive. Predictable. When systems begin to fracture, organizations reach for containment. Contracts, clauses, exposure limits. The illusion that structure can compensate for understanding. Review termination terms. The CFO said. No emotion, just sequencing. Because before you bring someone back, you need to know the cost of admitting you were wrong. At 9:51, counsel opened the file. Employment agreement, amendments. Addendums layered over years, each one solving a problem at the time, each one quietly increasing complexity. Retention clauses. knowledge transfer language, non-compete boundaries that stretched across regions. And then, a section most people would have skipped. Continuity protocol. Buried. Precise. Written not to be noticed, but to be invoked. The lawyer read it once, then again, slower. Who drafted this? She asked. No answer. But the timestamp told the story. 9 years ago. Before the current leadership. Before the last two restructurings. Back when systems were still being stitched together by people who expected them to outlive decisions. At 9:54, she continued reading. The clause wasn't aggressive, it was surgical. In the event of termination without validated knowledge transfer, any attempt to replicate or bypass critical operational logic would trigger a contractual review window. During that window, the former employee retained the right to consult, audit, and, if necessary, halt implementations that introduced measurable risk. Not permanently, strategically, and more importantly, at a rate defined in a separate schedule. The lawyer closed the document for a moment. Because this wasn't protection, it was leverage. At 9:58, the CFO received the summary. He didn't react immediately. He aligned it with the data instead. System degradation, contract exposure, escalating inefficiencies. And now, a legal framework that transformed a mistake into a negotiation. Clean, contained, expensive. At 10:02, he asked the only question that mattered. Can we operate without invoking this? A pause. Technically, maybe. Financially, unlikely. Because every minute the system drifted, the projected loss wasn't just holding, it was compounding. Not linearly, structurally. The kind of growth that doesn't spike. It accumulates until it becomes undeniable. At 10:05, operations confirmed what everyone was already calculating. Fallback systems were now handling 38% of active workflows. Inefficient, slower, costlier, and rising. At 10:07, the CFO finally sat down. Decision point, not emotional, not reactive, mathematical. He looked at the VP. No accusation, no tension, just a quiet recalibration of priorities. We need stabilization, he said. Not, we need her. Not yet. Because language matters when leverage is on the table. At 10:10, a draft message was opened. Subject line. Consultation request. Careful wording, neutral tone, no admission of fault, no urgency implied, only alignment and clarification. The kind of message designed to preserve position while acknowledging necessity. The kind that arrives too late to control perception. Across the ocean, her phone lit up. Unknown number, corporate domain. She didn't answer, not immediately. Instead, she let it ring once, twice, then stop. Because timing is part of the system too. And she understood it better than anyone. At 10:13, a second attempt. This time with a message. Short, controlled. We'd like to discuss transitional support. She read it. No reaction, no reply. Instead, she opened her laptop, not to respond, but to check something else. A private dashboard, independent, detached from the company's systems, but informed by the same logic. Metrics moved, exactly as expected. Not worse, not better. Predictable. She closed it. Because confirmation wasn't necessary anymore. At 10:17, back in the office, the first external impact surfaced. A partner flagged delays. Not critical. Yet. But visible. And visibility changes everything. Because internal issues can be managed. External ones cannot be contained. At 10:21, the CFO sent the message. No revisions, no hesitation. Because at a certain point, precision replaces pride. The email left the system, traveled across networks, arrived, read, but not answered, not yet. At 10:26, the room shifted again. No panic, but no illusion either. They had moved past the question of whether they needed her. Now it was about terms, and terms don't get better with time. At 10:29, The CFO spoke quietly. Prepare for escalation. Not loud, not dramatic, just inevitable, because the system had already made its position clear. It wasn't broken, it was incomplete, and the missing piece was no longer hypothetical. It was on a beach, under a different sky, holding all the time in the world. At 10:32, her phone vibrated again. This time, she picked it up, paused, and let it sit in her hand for just a moment longer. Because the next move wouldn't fix the system, it would redefine it. And somewhere, between silence and response, the balance of control was about to shift. At 10:33 a.m., she answered, not with urgency, with precision. Hello? No warmth, no distance. Just a tone that didn't offer leverage, but didn't surrender it either. On the other end, the CFO didn't introduce himself immediately. He understood something most people missed. The first sentence defines the frame, and the wrong frame, at the wrong moment, becomes a cost you carry through the entire conversation. We're seeing some instability, he said. Not a question, a statement, carefully underplayed. She didn't respond right away, because she didn't need to. Silence, in that moment, wasn't passive. It was diagnostic. It forced the other side to fill the gap, to reveal urgency without being asked. And we'd like to understand how to stabilize it, he added. There it was. Not if. How. She looked out at the horizon, the line between sea and sky, clean, unbroken, unlike the systems behind his words. You removed a dependency, she said calmly. Not accusatory, just accurate. A pause. Yes? No justification, no defense. Good. That meant he was already past denial. At 10:35, the conversation shifted. From narrative to structure. Current fallback load, she asked. 42%, he replied. Higher than before, rising. Routing discrepancies? Expanding. External visibility? A beat. Emerging. She nodded slightly, even though he couldn't see it. The system was behaving exactly as designed. Not failing, escalating, because that's what well-built systems do when a core element is removed. They don't collapse immediately. They reveal their dependencies, layer by layer, until the cost becomes impossible to ignore. At 10:36, she closed her eyes for a second. Not thinking, confirming. You don't need a patch, she said. You need a re-entry point. Silence on the line. Because that wasn't what they had been trying to do. They had been patching, bypassing, forcing continuity without understanding the architecture that made it possible. And you can provide that? He asked. Now it was a question. Direct. Clean. Yes. No hesitation, no explanation, because capability, at that point, wasn't the variable. Terms were. At 10:37, he moved. Under a consulting framework, he said. Careful wording again. Neutral ground. She almost smiled. Almost. Defined by the continuity protocol, she replied. Not aggressive, not defensive, just anchored. He didn't argue, because he had already read it. At 10:38, the room on his side was completely silent. Every eye on him, every decision now flowing through a single line of communication that hadn't existed an hour ago. Send your terms, he said. No negotiation, not yet. Because negotiating without stability would only increase the cost. And he knew it. At 10:39, she turned back into the room, opened her laptop, typed, not quickly, not slowly, deliberately, because structure matters more than speed when the system is already moving. At 10:41, the document was ready. Clear scope, defined access, boundaries on implementation, and a rate that didn't reflect time. It reflected impact. She read it once, not for errors, for alignment, then sent it. No extra message, no explanation, because everything that needed to be said was already inside. At 10:43, the CFO received it. Opened, scrolled, paused. Not at the numbers, at the control. Because this wasn't just consulting, it was architecture under authority, the ability to stabilize, but also to define how stabilization happens, and more importantly, what doesn't happen without her. At 10:45, he closed the document, looked up, no discussion, no debate, just a simple sentence. Approve it. The VP didn't respond immediately. For the first time that morning, he hesitated. Not because he didn't understand the situation, because he finally did. At 10:47, the approval was sent. At 10:48, she received it, read, closed her laptop, stood up, and for the first time since the call that morning, she moved with intention. Not away from the system, but back toward it. On her terms. At 10:52, access was restored, not fully, strategically. Entry points opened, logic paths reconnected. Hidden layers began to respond. Not instantly, but correctly, like a system recognizing a valid signal after noise. At 10:56, the first queue cleared. Not dramatically, quietly. At 11:02, routing stabilized across two regions. At 11:07, fallback load began to drop. 42%, 36, 29. Numbers didn't celebrate, they corrected. At 11:12, the CFO refreshed the report. $90 million. Still there, but no longer growing. That was the shift. Not recovery. Control. He leaned back slightly, not relieved, aligned. Because the system hadn't been saved. It had been understood. At 11:15, the office returned to its rhythm. Not the same as before, more aware, more precise. Because once you see a dependency, you don't forget it. Across the ocean, she closed her laptop again, this time without opening it. The air was the same, the ocean unchanged, but something else had shifted. Not in the company, in the balance, because they hadn't just brought her back. They had rewritten the structure that made her optional, and that was the part no report would ever show. Silence. Not empty. Resolved. At 11:23 a.m., the dashboard stopped drifting. Not instantly, not dramatically. They aligned. Numbers that had been leaning corrected their posture. Cues normalized. Latency compressed back into expected ranges. The quiet distortions that had spread through the system, like hairline fractures, began to seal. Not because the pressure disappeared, but because the structure underneath had been restored. No applause, just confirmation. At 11:27, the CFO refreshed the impact model again. $90 million, still displayed, but now accompanied by a second line, stabilization in progress. The projection curve flattened. Not reversed, flattened. The kind of shift only visible to people who understand trajectories, not moments. He nodded once, because that was the real metric. At 11:31, operations downgraded the status from systemic degradation to controlled recovery. Language adjusted, meaning followed. At 11:34, the VP finally spoke. What exactly did we miss? It wasn't defensive. It was late. Because the answer had already been demonstrated, not explained. Across the network, her inputs moved with precision. She didn't touch everything. She didn't need to. Only critical junctions. Decision nodes? The invisible intersections where logic wasn't documented, but defined behavior. Small adjustments. Targeted corrections. Reinstating pathways that had never been removed, only disconnected. At 11:38, a senior engineer watched the logs, line by line. He expected complexity. Instead, he saw clarity. No excess movement, no overcorrection, just intent. Why didn't we see this? He asked quietly. No one answered. Because visibility isn't the same as understanding. At 11:42, external alerts stabilized. Partners stopped escalating. Deadlines rebalanced. The ripple effect, so fast to expand, began to contract, not disappear. Systems remember stress, but they also recalibrate when the signal returns. At 11:47, the CFO received a short message. No greeting, no signature. Core routing restored. Monitoring variance. He read it once. That was enough, because it contained no reassurance, only state, and state is what matters. At 11:51, the room felt different, not calmer, sharper, because something had been revealed that couldn't be unseen. Efficiency had removed friction, but it had also removed awareness, and awareness, once lost, is expensive to rebuild. At 11:56, the VP stood near the glass wall, looking out, but not really seeing the city. For the first time, the question wasn't about systems, it was about decisions, about the cost of simplifying something that was never simple, about the difference between visible structure and actual dependency. At 12:02 p.m., the CFO closed the incident thread. Not archived, just closed. Because this wasn't an incident, it was a correction, a redefinition of how the company understood its own architecture. And more importantly, who defined it. Across the ocean, she sat back down, opened the laptop one last time, reviewed the live feed. Stable, not perfect. Systems rarely are, but stable. She made one final adjustment. Small, almost invisible. A boundary, not in code, in control. Then she closed everything. No follow-up message, no summary. Because none was required. They had the data, they had the access, they had the lesson. Whether they would use it was no longer her variable. At 12:10, her phone buzzed again. A short message from the CFO. Appreciate the support. She read it, paused, and for the first time that day, she allowed a response. Not long, not formal. Maintain the structure, sent, delivered. No reply. Silence followed, but not the kind from before. This one wasn't uncertainty, it was equilibrium, because the system hadn't just been stabilized, it had been rebalanced. And somewhere between removal and return, they had learned the only thing that matters in complex systems. What you can't see is usually what holds everything together.